So thanks, Pat, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. My story is, I came to one of the very first ones of these when I had just started at NASA, as a matter of fact. And back then, I kind of wanted to hide my badge saying I was from NASA. It was not the most welcoming community at that time. But over the years, we sort of danced around each other. And now, over the last few years, I'm happy to say NASA's really been embraced by this conference in the community. And I think that's probably appropriate. That journey that we had was probably appropriate. NASA wasn't the greatest partner 10 years ago. But now with the experience of Cots, which I went through, and also Commercial Crew, things are starting to change. And I have been able to see the power of partnerships. And that's what I want to talk to you today about. Public-private partnerships, specifically for spaceflight development. I can do this, right? Okay, Charles Darwin, this is one of my scientific heroes. This is a great quote. It is not the strongest of the species that survived, nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most responsive to change. An updated version of that is, those who live by the sword will be shot by those who don't. So anyway, when I think about this quote in terms of NASA, we have a lot of strong leaders at NASA, and we certainly have a lot of smart people. Our ability to change, maybe not so much. To use a corporate buzzword, that's probably not one of NASA's core competencies. So anyway, this is one aspect of our environment, obviously our budget. This is our historical budget from the beginning, and there's a lot of takeaways. A lot of people see this, and they look at the Apollo days, and they're like, hey, that's great. My takeaway is, if you change the perspective a little bit, let's just look at the last 25 years. This is not a trivial trend. This is a quarter century of data showing the reduced buying power of NASA. That's a pretty big difference when you look at the start and the end. It's been a gradual change, but it's definitely been a change for how NASA's buying power has over the years. So that's something we got to recognize, incorporate into our day-to-day activities and our plans for how we accomplish things. This is not a NASA slide. This is one that I borrowed from, it's getting kind of old now, and you don't need to read the exact lines. But what this shows is new programs, spaceflight development programs at NASA, 1992 all the way to 2010. Red are the canceled programs, blue, completed programs, and then incomplete, yellow. So, like I said, you don't need to read it, but obviously, what's the takeaway? There's a lot of red, right? A lot of red. And I think that's a consequence of the previous slide. Fortunately, we've seen the reverse trend from the private sector, a significant increase predominantly in the last 5 to 10 years in investing into space. So one's going down, one's going up. You can see bringing those two together could help potentially modulate some of those changes. And that's what I think is happening right now. And so what do I mean by these public-private partnerships? This is a chart that I've used before. You guys may have seen this. Some of you may have seen it in the past. And so you look at the program characteristics all the way on the left side, and I'll focus right now on the middle chart, the traditional approach. This is one that we're most familiar with NASA. It's the one that we've been using basically since the start of the space age. As a matter of fact, we're the owner of the spaceflight hardware as NASA. You generally use a cost-plus contract. You have a prime contractor. They have lots of subs, customers, really primarily, and not exclusively, if not exclusively, NASA. Funding for the capability obviously comes from NASA. Our role, we not only define the what, but the how as well. Requirements definition, that comes from NASA. I think I used a Wayne Hale chart that said shuttle had 10 to 12,000 requirements, depending on how you count. And we have less than 500 on Commercial Crew. And then the cost structure, generally NASA incurred the total cost. That's sort of the traditional model, still good today for a lot of the stuff that we do. And so what I mean by a public-private partnership, I call it a more commercial-oriented approach. I try not to use that word because then we get into debates about what commercial is. But this is what I mean. The owner of the hardware is industry. You generally have a fixed price arrangement. We have milestone-based contracts or milestone-based payments. We had that in Cots. We have that in Commercial Crew. It's a public-private partnership, and this is one of the key features. Customers, not only NASA, but also non-NASA or non-government customers as well. That's one of the key ingredients Funding for the capability, I mentioned, it's through milestone payments, so it's not based on cost, it's based on progress. It's based when you achieve a milestone that shows demonstrated progress, you get a payment. And one of the key things is NASA's role. We define the how. We still have some requirements, obviously, but industry defines the what, and then we approve it, then make sure that it satisfies our requirements. Requirements definition, higher level requirements, I mentioned that already. And then the cost structure, you're generally seeing a sharing of the costs. Now, I'm not saying you need every single thing to be a good public-private partnership, but most of those things is what will do it. And I think it can be a very good model given the right ingredients. And that's really my next slide. To contrast these, I'm not saying one's better than the other. They both have their place at NASA. For a technically ambitious, one-of-a-kind program where NASA's the only customer, production's limited to one or maybe just a few systems, the traditional approach is the right approach. And I would not advocate a public-private partnership for that because it would probably be, if not difficult, probably not successful. But for more commercially oriented programs, a public-private partnership can be more appropriate. It combines the strengths of both organizations. This is what I see every day, what I saw through Cots, also what I see with Commercial Crew. Government, we have a ton of experience, we have lots of data, we have lots of reports and test analysis that can be utilized for this, and we have significant financial resources. Consensus is at a premium in the government, right? So we're using public taxpayer funds, so that means you gotta have a lot of discussion, there's a lot of boards, there's a lot of meetings at NASA, right? And I think that's appropriate since we are using taxpayer funds. But it's just one of those features. On the private sector side, got a laser focus for cost effectiveness. We see this every day when we're working with our partners. Speed at a premium. So you bring these two together and it can be a very, very powerful tool for spaceflight development. But only when you have a lot of these key ingredients. So it needs to be applied carefully. It's not across the board, but when you've got the potential for non-NASA customers or non-government customers, it's a mission that is not really pushing the state-of-the-art technologically. That's a key feature because then you can, if you're not pushing the state-of-the-art, you can generally estimate your costs, and private industry is more willing to get into a fixed price arrangement. If you're pushing the state-of-the-art, really difficult. You might have some TBDs in your requirements. It's a very difficult scenario for you to ask private industry to sign a firm fixed price contract under that scenario. And we saw that with cargo, and I think with crew, what we felt like was that, low Earth orbit, humans, transportation to low Earth orbit is an extremely hard thing. It's one of the hardest things that we do. But NASA had done it successfully for several decades, over 100 missions to LEO with shuttle and some of the other flights, and we felt like it was mature enough so that we could turn it over to private industry. And we had companies that were capable not only financially, but also technically in accomplishing that mission. So you put all that together, plus a market outside of the government for human space transportation services, and it seemed to make sense to do Commercial Crew. That was kind of the fundamental underpinnings. And I see this working every day. I saw it through Cots and see it through Crew, and so that's why I think this can be a really, really good model. I think that's my last slide. So I know there's questions, and I will probably I'll take the first question because I almost always get this question when I give a presentation. And that question is, so Phil, how do you stay so young looking? No,
actually, Phil,
it's
not on the list.
It's not on the list?
It's
what?
not, but they're just starting, so people send your questions in for Phil.
No, I do actually know the question, I think. The big question that I usually get in these types of forums is what's next, right? What's going to be the next big partnership for NASA? And the answer is, I don't know. Maybe nothing, right? The last big program that we announced using funded Space Act agreements was Commercial Crew. That was 6 years ago. Funded Space Act agreements are one of the most powerful tools that we have at NASA for cost-effective spaceflight development. And it's sitting on the shelf gathering dust. So that's why I wanted to speak about this today. I think it's going to take all of us in this community to advocate for those partnerships when they make sense and for us to achieve them. And I think we can have a good future in those for those. Was that on the list?
So the number one most voted on question here follows off Mr. Bulk's presentation.
Okay.
Who approved your presentation and how hard was it to get approval?
Actually, this presentation I've given before, so it was pre-approved. So it was really easy this time.
Okay.
The first time, not so much.
Okay, moving right along. Doesn't the cost-sharing model hurt the small business that can compete? It doesn't hurt the small business that can be a major source of innovation? How do they compete with the internet billionaires?
So say that again?
Doesn't the cost-sharing model hurt the small business, which can be a major source of innovation?
Yeah, I don't know if it hurts the small business necessarily. I would just say it might not be the best opportunity for a small business. What we have found is innovation is definitely encouraged in these types of arrangements, and generally the partners go and find the small businesses and the subcontracts that they have where the innovation occurs. So we rely on the partners to go find those out. And whether or not your subs or your second tier or your third tier subs needs to do cost sharing, that's up to the prime. So I would say it just depends on how you look at it. I wouldn't consider it hurting. It just may not be the best type of program for a small business to engage in.
Here's a very good question for you, Phil. What changes, if any, would you make to the commercial crew program based on the lessons that you've learned over the last several years?
Commercial crew program is perfect. I would not change a thing.
Okay.
Let's see. No, I'll give it. Now that's a dodge, obviously. What changes would I make to the commercial crew program? Well, I certainly wouldn't change the leadership. Leadership's great. that's me. I think actually I'm pretty pleased with the commercial crew program. Did it play out exactly like I thought? No, but I think one of the lessons learned, Tim mentioned this, one of the lessons learned I have experienced over the last six years, there's only so much change that you can introduce into a system within a certain period of time. I think I might have been a little bit impatient early on about how much change that we could potentially instill in NASA, and I think now, today, I have a better appreciation for how hard that really is, and people really struggling with the change that we're trying to instill at NASA. It's a definite legitimate thing. It takes time to get comfortable with it. I had the benefit of the experience of Cots to see that these partnerships could really work, but not everybody had that experience. So that's one of the things that I think I've learned, and I think where we are today, where I have had to make compromises in my original vision for commercial crew, I think they were probably necessary in the end. So I'm actually pretty pleased with where we are.
Well, I'm done with the softball questions. I'll give you a real...
Is my time up? It's got to be up, right?
It says 16 minutes down there. We got a long time.
I should have talked longer.
Here's a real serious question. So what happens if there's an accident on a commercial crew vehicle? Will NASA, Congress, and the public be able to handle that differently than they did with the space shuttle?
Well, so that's a great question. I try not to answer these kinds of hypotheticals. It depends on the accident, right? Depends on the mishap. Depends on if there's fatalities or not. Right now, we've got a document in the commercial crew program that defines who has the responsibility depending on what kind of accident it is, what kind of impact it is, et cetera. But I do think it will be different. The model is different, right? The space shuttle was built under that middle column model where NASA was the owner-operator. This different model, there's different accountabilities. We call it a shared accountability within commercial crew. The companies are responsible. You might hear more about this in a future panel on commercial crew. The companies are responsible for asserting that they have met our requirements, and it's NASA's responsibility to verify and validate that. That's a very different accountability model than we had with shuttle. So I think it will be different in the future. How it exactly is going to play out, again, it'll depend on the nature of the accident, or the mishap, what the implications are, and where it happened, whether it was on NASA property or leased property or what kind of damage. So I'm going to...
Tough question.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of dodge that.
Let's see. Would cost sharing for LEO habitats be of interest to NASA?
So I don't speak for NASA, Whenever somebody asks me, is NASA interested or how does NASA feel about this? NASA's a big place, right? There's a lot of people, there's a lot of opinions, and I don't speak for NASA. I think if you guys listened to my boss's speech yesterday, Bill Gerstenmaier, LEO commercialization is definitely something. That's a strategy, that is a plan that we're putting in place. We're defining it as we go forward. So if anybody has a good idea for cost sharing, and that's just a feature. That shouldn't be the focus. It should be, do you want to do a partnership? If you want to do a partnership, then maybe cost sharing is appropriate. So I don't know if I would pull that feature and say, well, let's do a cost share. It depends on the situation. But I would say, yeah, we're definitely open for those kinds of ideas. We just had the RFI responses to the port on the ISS. Those came in with some very, very innovative responses, and that's helping shape our thinking and our forward strategy about what to do in LEO commercialization. So I would say now is really a good time for those ideas. We would be very receptive. Whether we would be interested or not, or whether we would incorporate that into our plans, I can't say.
So we've got a number of questions on cost sharing. That seems to be something that many people are interested in. So let me bundle these together, so bear with me a second. For cost sharing, is there a percentage of cost that you would find attractive? What percentage of commercial crew providers funding did NASA provide? Again, what's for cost sharing? What would NASA consider to be appropriate?
Right. So that's a great question, and I would say it's one that, particularly early in the Cots program, we spent a lot of time discussing. Where we came down in the end was we left it open to the market. We did not dictate a specific percentage, and I think that was the right approach. You let the market play out. We had, I believe, 22 proposals for the first round of commercial cargo, the first Space Act Agreement round. 22 proposals. That's a lot. That's a lot of competition. And when you have that many, we felt like the market could dictate that. If the companies had a good story, good technical, financial, management story, they would be able to get the funding they needed, and they could decide how much of that private funding they would be able to incorporate into their bids and how much they would rely on NASA. I think in a post-mortem we did on Cots, about 60% of the funding was private on Cots and about 40% came from NASA. It's a larger percentage from the government for commercial crew. I think that's probably appropriate. The dollars are a lot bigger on crew than it is in cargo, and I think the private market, at least initially, probably a little bit smaller than we had for the commercial cargo system. So there's no one answer. We just did the next step announcements, and they actually had a percentage in there for that. So no real one answer for everything. It depends. I like the approach of letting the market decide, but that only works if you have a lot of qualified vendors.
Okay, taking the other side of that, how have the new financing models for COTS affected the traditional large prime contractors?
You'd have to ask them. I don't know.
Are you running for office, Phil?
I don't like to speak for other people,
Okay. Let's see. A lot of these are kind of along the same lines. What kind of resources can NASA offer to help push projects forward in the commercial sector?
Oh, great question. Great question. As you probably know, after we finished COTS, and actually after we did crew, in my division, we also did an initiative called the Collaborations for Commercial Space Capabilities. These are no exchange of funds, Space Act agreements for us to provide expertise, data, resources to primarily entrepreneurial companies trying to develop commercial space capabilities. So we have 4 agreements. One was Orbital ATK for satellite servicing. They announced their MEV concept recently. So that's been a really good collaboration. We have another one with a company called Final Frontier, a small company up in Brooklyn to do IVA spacesuits. Obviously something NASA's in. We also have the agreement with SpaceX to do, it started out with some Mars stuff, and then we expanded it recently to encompass the Red Dragon. And then lastly, ULA, which is doing some very, very innovative things to get ready for their Vulcan engine. I've been very, very impressed with ULA and how they are transforming that company, really, and investing in new technology. So those 4 companies, what we're doing for them is we are providing a lot of data that already exists at NASA. This is a real benefit. The company gets the country gets the benefit of multiple times for the original dollar that we spent on this. You could get that data other ways, usually through Freedom of Information Act. It's a long, difficult process, and the end game is not always known. With these No Exchange of Funds Space Act agreements, the companies have a champion within NASA who can help ferret out that information. We have reviews. We see if the partners are having difficulty in one area, and you're like, well, no, we might have some expertise at Ames or Marshall or Glenn that could help you. Would you guys like to have some of that information? Yes, we can provide those documents as long as they're clear. We have a lot of technical interchange meetings. We have TIMs. If one of our partners is experiencing a problem in an area, we can bring in some of our subject matter experts, have a good 1-day, 2-day meeting, and the partners can solve problems significantly faster than they could have otherwise. So it's really providing a lot of benefit. We're not giving financial money to these companies. It's up to them since they're primarily entrepreneurial efforts. But NASA has these vast resources that we have accumulated over 50, 60 years of spaceflight, a lot of subject matter experts, and that's primarily the value that we provide.
I'm struggling a little bit with this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How does NASA police and prevent commercial companies from poaching or stealing intellectual property for use in their vehicles if they don't give visibility to the solutions used by the Cots providers?
So we have a very competent set of lawyers at NASA, IP lawyers, and they make sure that all of the agreements that we sign protect the government's interests. And it depends on the agreement. So, for example, the Red Dragon expansion, we are exchanging our expertise at a fairly robust level, much bigger than we originally anticipated, in exchange for the entry, descent, and landing data that we're going to get back, hopefully, from the Red Dragon mission. So that required a fairly unique set of IP clauses and not responsibilities, IP protections for both SpaceX and NASA. It took us about 3 months to negotiate that. And so I would say it depends on the agreement. I'll just say with Commercial Crew, we have full insight into what our partners are doing. We are in the factory floor with them day in, day out. So I think we have a good understanding of what they're doing. And so far it's worked out pretty good. That's a question, that's an interesting question. I hope if there's anybody that has heard of a story where that may have been an issue, feel free to come to me. I have not heard that to be a problem yet because we have so many good lawyers at NASA. I see one of them over there, right? They're all great, Margaret. I love the lawyers. We had a meeting one time early in Cots where there were more lawyers than engineers, and I thought I had to quit, but I didn't, fortunately.
Phil, thank you. Thank
you
my
pleasure.
For being a good sport and answering all these tough questions.